All right, good morning.
Morning.
Someone's awake. All right, so I'm going to be talking about my project, which is understanding and developing collaborative efforts among private landowners to increase the frequency of noxious invasive plant mitigation. Give you a little overview, give you a quick introduction. I'm going to talk about the human dimension that lies with private landowners. Talk about my study, methodology, my results, my management implications, and the future of this project. So in 1958, Charles Alvin said that we must make no mistake, we are seeing one of the great historical convulsions in our world's flora and fauna. And as of today, there are 30,000 introduced plant species worldwide. Looking at our regional data, that makes up about 50% of our flora in our island regions, and about 30% of our flora in our continental regions. This is largely due to the distributions and introductions through anthropogenic activities. These activities include such things as purposeful introduction for egg production, for land management objectives, for example, bringing in the tamarisk trees for soil erosion, and also for aesthetic appeal. So these species have a superior competitive ability over our native flora and fauna. It's due to several mechanisms that are associated with invasive plant species. A few of these are such things as greater fecundity and greater growth. For example, cheatgrass, or Rhomis tectorum, is an invasive annual grass that can actually produce up to 10,000 individuals in 1 square foot. Can produce up to 500 pounds of seed in a single acre. So limiting the spread and the distribution of this species has become a really large concern for resource managers and should be adopted by our community and our private land owners. You can see this is a bit of a breakdown of all the federal agencies across the United States. And looking at the western United States, 48% of all lands are made up of, are under federal ownership. This puts a huge burden on our federal agencies to mitigate invasive plant species. Social ecological literature suggests that non-federal landowners are engaging in limited management behaviors across private land ownerships. So if you kind of zoom yourself into Colorado and think about Gunnison County, where my focus of this project is, Gunnison County is made up of just a little over 2 million acres. That's 327,000 acres of private land ownership, which makes up right around 18% of all Gunnison County. This 18% of private land ownership is a very critical area to manage. Doesn't seem like a large number, 18%, but private lands are in direct proximity to roadways and waterways, which are large dispersal vectors for these species. So when talking about private land and weed management, we must bring in the human dimension to this element. And to create a comprehensive and to create a cross-boundary management, we must think about the human dimensions associated with these private landowners. For instance, looking at individual and group values. This will include such things as land management goals for such, say, agriculture or forage for agriculture, or if individuals are managing for riparian habitats, or such things as plant biodiversity or wildlife habitat management. And thinking about the interests that are involved with each user group and individual communities. Looking at the perspectives about social, economical, political, and ecological topics. So my study was to use a survey to evaluate the human dimension and to look at the ideologies behind why private landowners are implementing invasive plant management, are selecting specific species, which management objectives they're using, and overall, what are the management goals of these species. So I obtained all the land ownership for Gunnison County from the Gunnison County's assessors list and the Gunnison County Geographic Information Systems Department. And what I did is I selected landowners that were between 5 and 50 acres and were under the account types of, account type meaning land use, under the account types of residential, mixed use, and agriculture. I then took this data into ArcGIS and ran a spatial query to select landowners in Gunnison County that met this specific criteria. I then took this data and exported it into Excel, where I used the rand function to randomize the selected 200 landowners out of the 1,900 landowners that made this criteria. So during this time, I created a survey of 14 questions that I wanted to look at and observe from landowners. It included, their perceptions on invasive plant species, what management strategies were being used and what capacity, identifying particular plant species that they were going after, what they were looking for, what they were targeting, and then looking at really the land management goals, if it was riparian health, if it was plant biodiversity, if it was wildlife habitat. When respondents were giving the survey, I also made a general species list. This list is made from the most abundant species that the Gunnison County Weed Management Program targets. When respondents were given the survey, they were also prompted to list any species that they found to be a nuisance or weedy. This was just a general list, a reference list for them to look at. So I sent out a pre-survey letter explaining the project, explaining who I was, and really prompting landowners to get involved in the community by either responding to me via email or directly over the phone. If they responded to me through email, I prompted them to a SurveyMonkey account that I had set up where they could take the survey online, or they could call me directly. This letter also kind of prompted landowners to have the ability to communicate any concerns or issues or questions that they may have had as well. So a lot of it became somewhat of an informal interview. About a month, or exactly a month after I sent out the pre-survey letter, I sent out a reminder letter to those who had not responded yet. And so the results, out of the 200 selected landowners, I only had 26 landowners respond, so it's roughly around a 13% response rate. And out of that, 36% found invasive species to be very problematic. Only 19% said that they did not find species to be problematic. And this is kind of broken down into the user groups that I had selected. You can kind of see that only agriculture and residential landowners found species to be very problematic. Looking at the impacts that landowners found to be associated with invasive species, displacement of native species and a decrease in biodiversity were the two largest. And you can see that here. Landowners were allowed to select multiple answers for this question, so the percentages don't equal 100. But you can see out of the land use groups, these were the ones that were selected to be the most problematic. Looking at management strategies within Gunnison County, chemical and mechanical were the two highest treatments preferred. And you can see that out of all user groups that were self-performed, and mostly less than 5 acres had been treated on the private lands in Gunnison County. Species that were most familiar were Canada thistle and musk thistle, above 50% up to 100% through all land user groups. And this is looking at each individual land use group and the number of species that they're identified with or were familiar with. And again, this is kind of looking at the overall land management goal of private lands, and it's a bit of a mix, but just for example, residential use found that managing for plant biodiversity was high, very important, and for riparian health was moderately important. So looking at management implications of this project, creating this education and assistance programs to increase awareness, concern, and really to give landowners the capability to manage their lands is high priority. I've kind of come up with 4 different subcategories of this. And looking at prioritizing land management goals should be a primary objective. This would allow educators and resource managers the opportunity to create a land use group awareness. Looking at land surveys, 73% of survey respondents said that they were willing to have their land surveyed. I think this would be a huge step forward with our program, with the Gunnison County Weed Management Program, and looking at what to prioritize as infested areas. Correct treatments. 76% of respondents said that they had self-performed treatments on their lands. Looking at things and teaching landowners about proper timing of treatments, and making sure that they're selecting the right herbicides, using the right label rates on ounces of herbicide, and calibrations for equipment is highly important for creating efficient management. And species awareness. Again, Canada thistle and musk thistle were the two largest species that landowners were familiar with. But to create a cross-boundary comprehensive management plan, all these state-listed noxious weeds and nuisance weeds should be looked at. So the real product that's coming out of this research is, over the winter, I helped assist in writing a grant with the Gunnison County Weed Management Program, and we were awarded funds through the Colorado Department of Agriculture for the growing season of 2016, this summer. And what I'm loosely calling the Private Land Initiative. And I'm going to take those 4 categories and break that down again to looking at prioritizing land management goals, surveying lands, looking at when landowners are performing treatments, and really creating that species awareness. Also through that, when we were looking through partners and outreach, like continuing with working with the Crested Butte Wildflower Festival and leading invasive plant identification tours to reach out to our community. So in conclusion, really what this project did is start that conversation and get the funding to continue this conversation. By starting that conversation, it kind of created this positive feedback loop, I'm hoping, where education awareness is going to keep increasing species mitigation, and in the end, hopefully, there'll be a reduction in dispersal opportunities and unwanted species. So I'd like to say a quick thank you to all of you for being here this morning, and I'd like to say thank you to lecturer and graduate faculty, Dr. Tom Grant, and to Gunnison County Weed Management Program Coordinator John Levelstone. Any questions? Go ahead.
Out of the people that got back to you on the survey, did you feel that there was more of a positive response to you looking into their lands and some of the invasive species?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I feel like there's a pretty overlying bias in my project, that those that are already engaged when working with invasive plant species were the ones that responded to me, because they wanted to continue to be involved. So there was a lot of positive feedback. And I hope that that's that positive feedback loop where these folks are now talking to their neighbors about, hey, I took the survey, this is what we did, and talking to their friends, hopefully getting those who are disengaged to be engaged.
This is kind of related, and it comes from Philip Wiki online, and he says, you know, obviously there's some cool findings that you got from the 26 people, but why do you think the response rate was so low, and is there anything that you think you could have done to raise that response rate?
Yeah, I think it's kind of based off the answer that I just kind of gave, is basically those being involved, wanting to stay involved. To increase the response rate, well, hopefully this public lands initiative that we're trying to get going this season will put the word out there more and get those who are not being involved to become more involved. And as far as the survey, I'm not exactly sure how I've got more people to respond. Anybody else?
Are you going to try to resurvey maybe after a period of time to see if you get more response and more, you know, participation?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. For the future of the program, I'd really like to see this turn into a permanent seasonal that would work directly with private landowners for the future. I think having that data in the future will help us write grants for more funding. So yeah, I think that would be an excellent option for us.
What's the law say? Like, you know how you're supposed to not have weeds in your yard and you're supposed to take action, and what's legally the obligation for these landowners?
So legally, they're obligated to treat these plant species under the law, and Gunnison County is supposed to be enforcing that. As of right now, and the way the program is that we want to set up, so we don't necessarily want to be the enforcers out there right at this moment. We want to be the ones out there creating these positive conversations. But if, after a certain amount of years go by and they're not partaking and managing for their lands, it can be brought to the county commissioners, and they can be essentially fined.
You mentioned correct treatment. I'm wondering, can you describe like the incorrect treatment or what was going wrong, maybe
Sure.
the solution that you found to that?
Yeah, so for treatment, there's all kinds of different options, but I talked about two important ones, and looking at timing. So let's use cheatgrass for an example. It's an early spring and late fall annual grass. That grass comes up in the spring, and usually by mid to late summer, it's already gone to seed. So if landowners are out there in late summer pulling all this cheatgrass thinking they're doing a great job, they're basically wasting their time and they miss the opportunity to get out there and pull cheatgrass. As for selection of herbicides, it's hugely important to know exactly what you're doing with herbicides to do the right thing. There can be a lot of damage to our native plants if the wrong herbicide selected, if the wrong measurements are used in ounces of herbicide, and if the wrong equipment is calibrated. I think I answered that question. Yeah.
So has there been any proactive thinking about with grant programs about buying equipment and chemicals, and then having training programs for the landowners as far as bringing them in and showing how to use and apply?
So as of right now, Gunnison County is kind of staying back out of that. But there are POAs that are around the area that are implementing these backpack programs. Mount Crested Butte, CB South have a program where you can go to them and they mix the chemicals for you, give you the equipment, and send you on your way. All right, well, I want to thank you all.